Um, 2 weeks ago, the state of Russia, the oil enterprise for the state of Russia, turned off the oil going to the Czech Republic because the Czech Republic made some favorable comments about the way they participate in NATO. They changed their mind after a few days, the Czech Republic did. When things like this happen, a sovereign nation being forced into a foreign policy change by completely irrelevant means, and instead of looking at it as an act of war, our newspapers, if they report it, stick it into a 2-column story on page 17, which is where it was. I recall the phrase strategic inflection point. That is a phenomenon I noticed with technological change. I concocted it up. Diagram to denote a strange transition point when, if you don't recognize the signs that you are at the transition point, or you don't act on them, you determine the fate of the organization that this discussion refers to. I originally thought of business enterprises and the transitions and transformations that they decide to undertake or not undertake at that point. But I think this absolutely as much refers to societies, to countries, and we may well be at a point corresponding to a strategic inflection point for our country, for the energy industry, which is a $7 trillion industry worldwide. And we are so far doing the very worst that we could do, that I found an organization can do, which is worse even than ignoring that there is such a problem, talking around it, deliberately going out of our way to pretend that the signs are not there. Consider the world around us. There is books being written about the world after the United States, bestsellers. We blame the change, the dramatic change in oil prices to speculation, which simply what I don't understand. There are people who pronounce the end of oil and coin the phrase of peak oil, and there are people who treat it like a religious dogma and choose not to believe in it. Meanwhile, we are well aware of globalization in every other context, but we have not considered that globalization applies to forms and sources of energy, like oil that can be put on a boat, and even though it was drilled in the Alaskan Wildlife Preserve or the shore of California or in Texas, ends up fueling cars or other uses of energy in whatever continent the boat has to. The continent and the country that the boat is most likely to head to is China, which is one of the largest and most dramatic economic stories that is happening in front of our eyes. This is a comparison of the U.S. energy consumption, plotted on a second-order graph, and we'll attention to that, compared to the Chinese energy consumption. And the only reason I can't prove to you that the two lines have crossed over is because I don't have 2008 8 data fully available at all for China. We are collectively neglecting the source of our life, energy in various forms. And the phrase, the tragedy of commons, that has various classical origins, but it's basically talking about the simplest form. When you graze, multiple entities graze a territory and they overgraze because it doesn't belong to anybody, and then you starve, is what comes to mind. What is at stake for us is, as my example indicates, not just economic security, which we are witnessing every time we pull up the pump, but national security, the ability to make our own decisions in the country. We need to adopt a recognition of this problem. We need to adopt to the concept of a solution, which is to develop a certain degree of immunity, which are called energy resilience, being able to adapt to changing conditions that we cannot control by controlling our own means of adaptation. Let me sketch a diagram to you, which is a simple form of a simple look at the energy industry today. This is a box that shows the customers on the top, the business segments, residential, industrial, and transportation, and all the major energy input elements from coal, renewables, all the way to oil. What is important here is, while oil can be used in all three segments, the forms of energy that are used in the other two cannot be used in transportation. There's a wall preventing the ability to mix, which is often called as the characteristic of fungibility between different forms of energy. The most important thing we need to do is to transform the energy industry. Not a minor task, $7 trillion industry, in such a way that energy sources can be fully fungible. And what we need for that is transportation that joins the other industrial sector, the industrial and residential sector, in sharing the characteristic of flexibility in being able to use different sources of energy. And that full fungibility, which is a necessity to be able to adapt to unpredictable changes in the energy environment, depends on the introduction of electricity in transportation. Electricity has an additional factor that is in the era of globalization and both going from the source of energy to the highest bidder in the world, has another characteristic. It is much easier to rely on your local resources if they come to you in the form of electricity, because electricity, so to say, is sticky to the locality where source of energy was produced and converted into energy.